Hey there, everybody. Um, we're going to go ahead and get started. Tonight's not going to be super long. Mostly this is going to be a check-in. And I also needed to get peer reviewers assigned and everything. So you guys have the opportunity to get some feedback from each other. um, oh, let's see what happened here. I'm going to redo the peer groups. Part of the challenge was that it doesn't tell me who is inactive, and we had a couple of people who wound up dropping out of the class, and I don't want you to wind up assigned to somebody who's not actually in the class. So I'll get that fixed. Um, so just real quick, so far the stuff that I have been seeing from you in class has been great. Been very impressed with the level of work. Some of you clearly are already professional instructional designers, so this gives you the opportunity to practice and kind of build some projects on your own, sharpen your skills, learn some new ways of doing things. And I love reading your reflections because I feel like you're putting a lot into it and you're getting a lot back out of it. So I just have to say, I really appreciate how much work you're doing here. It's hard to express how much growth I've seen just already with some of you, um, just from one to the next iteration. There's just so much in terms of just making it really interesting and fun. You're really thinking through what you want students to learn so that the specificity continues to improve. It's just been really nice to see. Um, so, my apologies. I'm trying to shift gears real quick. I'm sure a lot of you have the same experience. I got a phone call just before I was about to teach from my father, and he needed me to fix his computer remotely. He's down in Sugar Land, Texas, and so I have a remote access tool on here, so I had to take over his computer and fix some things for him. He does the same thing that my 10-year-old does, and he will often go to websites he should not and accidentally download things that he should not, and that negatively impacts his computer pretty significantly. So the stage that you're at now, and I have it on my agenda to grade the stuff that you turned in last night tomorrow morning, because I want to get it back to you as quickly as possible on your designs. And I've already scanned them. I just need to get in and give you guys feedback. And so far, I'm very impressed with your ideas for what you're putting together on this. The next stage is going to be developing the materials that go along with your instructional design. Now, one of the tools that is available if you are interested that students have used in the past, you've got all of your standard tools. You can build PowerPoints. It's one of those things that I'm always kind of flabbergasted when I do instructional design for clients. They all invariably want some form of PowerPoint. And part of the reason for that is PowerPoint can be helpful in that it allows you to do voiceovers, and it allows you to just have something that people can like flip through and look at a presentation on their own without you having to be there. And people are just very comfortable with PowerPoint. So even though it's not the best, it's definitely something that you just kind of need to be prepared for, that people are going to ask you to use PowerPoint. I just had to do 2 PowerPoints because the clients that I'm working with are overseas, and because they're overseas, that's just what they're comfortable with, and you often have to think about what people are going to be comfortable with. Sometimes you want to do really high levels of innovation with the materials that you're producing. And sometimes people just want a PDF document with directions for what to do on it, um, because that's just what they're comfortable with. But another really big thing that you want to think about as you're developing your materials and thinking about your audience is, can they use the materials? Um, One of the big challenges that we're having with online education right now in the field of learning technologies is we have a tendency to think that because, like, I live in the Dallas Fort Worth area, I lived in Houston, I lived in Bloomington, Indiana, I lived in Detroit, Los Angeles, all fairly, I mean, except for Detroit, of course, fairly affluent areas that had what they needed. And the big thing that I'm consistently worried about is whether or not the people at the other end are going to have access to the technology necessary for them to do what I want them to do. And so I did a project 10 years ago, and this dude convinced these folks that what they needed for their master's course was an alternate reality game, because that was a thing that I did, was alternate reality course games. And I built this whole massive online ghost story thing. We did really high end video, just tons and tons of distributed stuff, just really intense work and everything. And this is what the person who was going to teach the class wanted. That's what they told us they wanted. So we built it, and it took 3 months and working like 15, 20 hours a day to produce this really high end material. And they got it. It's not really what was appropriate to them, because they had a ton of students who couldn't access the materials because it was all way too high end. So one of the biggest questions that I can ask right now is, especially with those of you who do K-12, but also for higher ed, is, are folks ready to use what you've made? So anybody here know one of the biggest challenges with delivering a PowerPoint in many instances? Yeah, a projector is definitely one of them. But I mean, just delivering it to people so that they can look at it, especially if it's a good one. Yeah, so internet access, yeah, file type's another one. Files are too big. That is generally the biggest complaint I get, but all of these things that you guys have mentioned are definitely problems. But I can't even send anything over 25 megabytes through my work email. The speaker notes is definitely a challenge, especially if those two things get flipped on the screen and people are looking at your notes instead of seeing what you're supposed to have up there because it's not set up right. Those are all issues. But if people can't get the slides at all, that's a problem. Accessibility is another issue. Working speakers is a huge problem for sure. Yeah, and I like that, and I agree with you, Ashley. And I love that suggestion. Using Google Slides definitely can be better. And you can also, one of the things that you can actually do is create a movie and upload a movie to, say, YouTube or something, and share a link with a voiceover, and that can be fairly well easy, easily done. Um, Whether or not they have their own device is definitely going to be a huge problem. And I was working with some folks trying to figure out how to solve the problem of delivering education to kids in rural Louisiana back in March, April, May. And so few kids had access to the internet or to computers. Uh, any idea what the two main ways they wound up delivering education to students were in rural Louisiana? And actually, I think they did it in Mississippi, Alabama, parts of Kentucky as well. Mail was one for sure, um, with the packets, but they didn't do a lot of that because they couldn't afford the printing costs. So that was one of the things they were trying to reduce, is the printing costs. Nope, they couldn't access email because they didn't have computers or cell phones or any internet access. Um, in many rural parts of the United States, folks don't have access to internet because the only thing that's available is satellite, and satellite can be slower than the old dial-up. Um, they couldn't do phone calls either because they didn't have a robocall system set up. So what they did is they used radio, because some of them didn't have TV either, because to do TV you'd have to have a functional TV. But they pretty much all had access to radio because their parents usually had at least a working radio in the house or in the car. So what would happen is the teachers would record what they wanted the students to do, and they had to compress it down to like no more than, I think, a minute and a half to 2 minutes. And so the principal would get on and basically play each of the teachers giving that, and then the students would have to write it down with pen and paper, which pen and paper or pencil and paper is a form of technology. It's an older form of technology, but it is definitely one. So yeah, they did some good chunking, but this is what we wound up having to do. And some of my, or in fact, my very first article was on rural schools in Indiana, and they really struggled with having access to technology. Not because they didn't have the devices, because they got a lot of good like cast off technology from Indiana University where I went to school, but their internet was so bad out there that often they could only get access to the internet for maybe like an hour a day. So they would have to just kind of restructure the way that school worked in order for it to function. But again, part of the challenge was a lot of the time we design an intervention, an instructional intervention, whether it be the design of instruction like we're doing, or just trying to implement the use of technology in schools, and we buy the devices, but we don't really check to see if students are ready. And that is a pretty severe problem. Sorry, I'm trying to find this other thing. Has anybody ever heard of Articulate Storyline or used it? What, you want to tell us about it, Mark?
I haven't used it extensively. I've vetted it against several other, including Adobe product, you name it, pretty much anything for content creation. So I've actually reviewed it, but I haven't actually sat down and done a project with it.
No problem. So the whole reason that I mention it is it is a product that exists that has, that if you want to build content and you just want to play with it for your own edification during this course, feel free. I'm going to put it up here in the resources, just the URL to the free trial. I think it's, I can't remember, I think it's a month that you get with it. And it, in reality, all it does is it does a lot of screen capture. It allows you to do some video. It lets you do some interesting stuff with PowerPoint. But a lot of what you do in it, you can do in other tools that are less expensive. For the last 3 years, I've been paying, I think, $1,200 a year for Articulate Storyline. And what I keep finding is it makes really huge files, was one of my challenges with it. And I had a terabyte hard drive and it was constantly full because every time I would try to build anything, and it would just make these huge files. But it's interesting, and a lot of folks, and part of the reason we're having this conversation is I just want those of you that are thinking about being professional instructional designers, a lot of people want you to at least be familiar with it. They want you to have played with it just to have an idea of what the product is. Some would like you to have extensive experience in it, some actually use it. But that's definitely one that you can play with. And it's an authoring tool is what they call it. But you don't have to use authoring tools to make good instructional resources in this development phase. Again, if you want to do voice over PowerPoint in certain instances, that may be appropriate. Like was mentioned before, chunking is really good. You could chunk something with a PowerPoint that leads to, that is really just some information for a mini lesson on a particular concept, and then have students practice it independently, and then um, build out however you want to build it out uh, in response to what the client wants. So PowerPoint's there. Another tool that a lot of folks use is Adobe Captivate. This is another one that's fairly expensive. Um, I've used it a few times, but it was always way more expensive than I was willing to um, pay for, and the university was not willing to pay for it. So I don't mess with it. But they also have a free trial if you want to mess with it. And you can do a subscription apparently now for $34 a month. But what I keep finding is I'll pay for something for a while and then find out that everybody wants something different. So maybe it would be useful if I had a particular client that wanted to use Adobe Captivate for what they're making, and just pay the $34 for the month that it would take me to build everything out. So Adobe Captivate has some additional features for making instruction, but it largely does a lot of screen capture. So that's available. Um, has anybody played with TechSmith's Camtasia?
Yep.
How do you feel about it?
It's the product has actually improved greatly. I'm much more a fan of Captivate, to be honest, but that's simply because there's so much more functionality in it. But that also makes it, again, the more bells and whistles you have, the harder it can be to mess with and be for clients to use in the end sometimes.
Oh, for
But
sure.
Camtasia's, at least at least down here in Houston, it's fairly ubiquitous at the universities down here, and other ones I've seen too. I think part of that's cost, and they got it, and they got in the door early on too.
Yeah. Um, and I've always liked it. I will use it. Um, Snagit is definitely a good part of it. I like it. One of the guys that I went to graduate school with actually worked for them. I don't know if he's still there. Um, but the people there are also, I guess, really nice, and I like to support companies that take good care of their folks and do a good job. So those are all some kind of authoring tools, but there's a lot of other things. You can just use screenshots in many instances to build stuff out. Sometimes, like I said before, sometimes people just want PDF documents with images in them. Uh, but finding YouTube videos out there that do the job better than you have time to do is always helpful. If you do need to record video for yourself in whatever that you're building requires, you can use Zoom if you've got Zoom. Anything that's going to do a recording for you, you can always record and build into some other product. But for the purposes of our project this summer, it doesn't need to be crazy. My whole goal here is for you to focus on the pedagogy, focus on making sure that students can meet your learning goals, uh, make sure that it meets the needs of the instructor and the students, and that it uses the technology that you have students use in a mindful way. I'm sure I've said this before. One of the things that gets the most in the way of people in the field of educational technology, instructional technology, learning technologies, whatever you want to call it, is we focus too much on the tools. What's more important is, let's say you are creating a video for students to watch before they go and are expected to practice something. What makes the video meaningful is that you thought about the best way to deliver the communication in there, that you've written some sort of coherent narrative that conveys the information in a meaningful way. It matters that the images that you've put along there, the media, the audio, the visuals complement one another in a meaningful way. It matters that you worry about the pedagogy first. It matters that you've made some sort of engaging um, activity for them to participate in. I mean, I could teach this class in the way that it was taught when I got here, which was students read book chapters about instructional design, and then what do you suppose they did in this course after they read the book chapter? Back into, yeah, quizzes and tests. That's exactly what happened. And then at the end of the course, you took a big exam over all the concepts. There was zero application at all. And so in this instance, I mean, I need you guys to walk out of here prepared to do instructional design. So simulating practice, even if it's not as authentic as I'd like it to be, I'd love it if I had an instructional design company where I could give you guys real world projects. But you guys are building as close to real world projects as much as possible. And I'm glad you do, because I want you to be ready. That's part of understanding your audience is, what do you need when you walk out of here? And honestly, as an instructor, the only way for me to really tell if you're learning stuff is to see your reflection on it, see the evidence of your evolution in what you're doing, how you're improving from one project to the next to the next. And it's just, honestly, as an instructor, it's just a lot more fun for me too. It's a lot more engaging than just seeing if you passed the quiz. Um, I can tell if you could pass a quiz because you did the work and you did it successfully. So that's just a whole different way of thinking about stuff. But I do want you to know that there will be people who just want you to make quizzes. So I've been working with this outside client, and they're kind of new to doing instructional design work. Very kind people, a little naive in some ways. I understand because I've been that naive many times. And so this particular country and their education ministry, uh, I built out this massive instructional design project that was going to have a lot of support for teaching people how to create really strong online learning. We did 3 weeks putting together the proposal for this country, and I felt like it was really good. We got really good feedback from the American partners, and then the folks at the university in this country came back and, what do you think they asked us for? I said, okay, you did all this stuff, we don't care. What do you, we want this one thing. What do you suppose they asked me for? It is related to that for sure. They just wanted test banks. They want us to just make a ton of test banks that go along with their medical and dental education. Now, part of the problem was that, as far as we can tell, they don't have textbooks, like standardized textbooks. Most of their instruction comes from oral tradition and word of mouth. So, and a lot of it's like applied practice face to face in classrooms. So I'm not sure how to create test banks further. It's not in English. Um, and most of their subject matters, their English isn't very good. Um, so I'm not sure how to do that. But you will get clients who turn around and say, okay, I understand you want to do things the right way. That's not what we're interested in. And sometimes you can help clients like that and you can do that kind of development. Sometimes you can't. But I will say this one thing that's pretty helpful just to keep in mind because you may get frustrated with it. I was a little frustrated at first, but I'm like, hey, I expected this. It's not. I thought it was for time's sake at first, but it's not. It's that they disagree with. They don't want to do online education. Period. They disagree with the entire model of online education. They think it sucks. They don't like it. They don't really want to do it, but they're being kind of painted into a corner. Um, so they're doing it because they have to. Um, so they're trying to do it in as just crappy a fashion as they possibly can so they can have something, but they definitely don't want to do it the right way. And that happens a lot. You get clients who are like that. They don't want to do it the right way, they want to do it their way. Well, that's all right. They're the client. You need to meet their requirements. Um, but what you can do to turn that kind of frustrating experience into a positive for you and for them is I can't build that. I don't have access to those kinds of materials. I can't really help them. However, I can generate ideas that can potentially help them. And so they'll appreciate me having helped them. And I can link them up with somebody else who might have the resources for that kind of a project. And then both groups wind up pretty happy with me. And if they have something in the future where they want to do it better, they want to do it right, or they can just funnel something to me that kind of is helpful, great. So in that instance, I recommended instead of our group doing it, that they instead speak with uh, folks from universities in other countries that their instruction is done in Arabic. They have a similar educational model, and they have medical schools and dental schools that might already have these materials built or have instructional designers that in some instances I trained myself who I can refer them to who they can either partner with the other university to build those um, course banks or they can hire independently one, two, three of my former students who can then build this for them, solve the problem, and get paid, and everybody wins. And then everybody's happy with me. And in the future, they might want to come back to me to do something else if they want to do something more advanced or more in my wheelhouse. Um, and that's partly what I'm just mentioning in this instance is we want to do everything, but we can't do everything. And part of what you want to consider as an instructional designer is whether or not you can do it well. So you always want to be able to deliver, and you really want to over deliver. Um, and you also have to have a pretty thick skin with these folks that are your clients because they're the ones paying you and they want a product that is kind of the way that it's envisioned in their head. So you may spend 5, 6 hours building something that you think is great, spend all this time and captivate, and you've built out great video and all this really nice instruction, and they come back and like, nope, I want PowerPoint. My students won't get this. They won't like it. I want PowerPoint, and you have to go back and redo it. Well, part of the problem is with the initial needs analysis, you also have to remember that you're going to have to return to things because people don't always know what they don't know. They don't always know what they want. And sometimes they don't even really understand what you're asking. But they don't tell you that. And this can also be a cultural thing. They want to save face. They don't ever want to tell you that they don't understand something because it may not culturally be okay to convey that. So sometimes people, instead of telling you at the time they didn't understand what you were saying, will come back and just be angry that it wasn't what they wanted, but they're not really angry. It's just how they have to convey it culturally in order to deal with the social structure that they're in. So I didn't have a lot of issues with that doing instructional design in the United States with K-12 folks or higher ed folks. Everybody was pretty okay with stuff. And if they didn't understand or like something, you could have a nice conversation. But in other countries, people will get loud, not because they're mad at you, but because that's what they have to do with the group of folks that they work with in order to convey things in a way that shows power and authority. And they will often come back and have a side private conversation with you to tell you that. So don't react right away. Give yourself some time and wait for them to talk to you and reflect and think about whether or not you really did mess something up. Now, part of the other issue with the needs analysis in this instance is I didn't get to do the needs analysis. Um, so I am doing this work as a contractor for this other organization. It's kind of summer work that I'm doing. And the way that their internal structure is that I, as a contractor, am not invited to those conversations, even though I am the one with the highest level of knowledge and skill in that particular domain. And so what seems to keep happening is they'll go and have this meeting and they're not asking the right questions. And I will have a conversation with them afterwards and I'll realize that they didn't ask any of those questions. And sometimes in the next meeting, they'll ask the questions, and sometimes they won't. And I still haven't figured out why they don't in some instances, but it seems to be a cultural thing in some instances. And in other instances, I just want you to think about how complex the potential needs are in the projects that you've done so far. Because I'm thinking back to what I've read that you guys have written in your reflections, and there's so much we don't know. And then if you add a cultural barrier and you add a language barrier and you add some power barriers in there, um, it just makes it really easy to mess it up, which is why needs analysis when you're working internationally can take way longer, even than what we've already talked about. And so it's just part of what you want to expect, I guess, is that everything just takes way longer in normal circumstances than you plan for. And then once you add an international component, it's going to take like 5 to 10 times longer than that. So that's just based on my experience so far, um, something that I would mention. The other thing that I will say is that so I built 2 courses in Moodle for this client that we do have a contract with. And then they come back after going through the course and seeing all the stuff that's been built. And do you know what they told me they want instead? Any thoughts? I've already alluded to it earlier. Oh, Yes, you hit it right there. They want PowerPoint. They want 1 hour long PowerPoint in the morning, 1 hour long PowerPoint in the afternoon on Tuesday, 1 hour long PowerPoint on Thursday in the morning, 1 hour long PowerPoint in the afternoon on Thursday. So I spent probably 200 hours building these other courses, redoing the courses a couple of times based on um, the, the company expectations. Yeah, and that's okay. So I'm going to reuse these courses for my little independent company and just offer these courses if people want to take them. Um, and, you know, see what goes there. It's never wasted work. And that's something that I want you to remember. Even if you wind up not using something that you've developed in terms of your materials, you may find later on that you have another project where it's really good. It fits really well with that. And so you'll wind up using it another time. So I just want you to think about that because we all do stuff as professionals who are like, man, I can't believe I wasted all of that time building that thing. There's always another time. There's always another time where you're going to wind up needing what you built there. It may not be an exact format. You may need to revise it, but going through the process, you build some stuff. We don't use all of it necessarily, but it doesn't mean that it's not good. It doesn't mean that it's wasted. It may just not be appropriate to now, and that's okay. Um, Again, working professionally as an instructional designer, it it can be frustrating, but it can also be really amazing because what I'm finding, and part of the reason, one of the things that you guys commented on that I really liked is the iterative nature of instructional design. One of the things that I really love about this, and I think part of this is I was once upon a time, one of my undergraduate degrees is creative writing, and feedback on our work, feedback on an iteration of something that we've built can help us make it a lot better. It can give us a perspective on what we built in a way that we can transform it into something that is several levels higher than what it was. It is an opportunity to just keep doing better and do something more if we look at it that way. If we just look at it as a bunch of tasks we have to get over with, instead of almost kind of an art form. And this is an engineering process, but a lot of engineered things like architecture can be really beautiful in the outcomes at the other end of these processes that we use. And so some of the best poems I ever wrote as an undergraduate were ones where I rewrote the thing 6, 7, 8, 10, 15 times until I found a way to really make the story, the emotional component resonate. And it's the same thing with instructional design. Finding a way to communicate what we want people to learn, it can be a really elegant thing. It requires iterations, but you know, those iterations are opportunities to keep making the stuff better. And just to give you an example, there's this class. It's this really, I don't know, they gave it to me because I was new here, and it was an opportunity to deal with a problem that they were having. It's called LTEC 1100. This is undergraduate course that's basically just computer literacy skills. And you learn Microsoft Office and basic netiquette principles and basic Boolean searches. It's really for students who come in and just don't really understand computers particularly well. We teach the hardware parts, the software parts, like what is a computer, that kind of stuff. And you would be surprised. Well, I don't know if you would be surprised. I was a little surprised at how many students were coming out of high school just not having any basic computer literacy skills. Now, I had worked as a technology specialist in high school not that much earlier, so I was kind of surprised that so many kids just didn't have those skills. But I can tell you, the average course like that is incredibly boring. Most of them today use things like My IT Lab, and it's just simulations to learn how to open and close documents in Word and how to make basic PowerPoints. And it's eh, just really boring. So I turned it into an alternate reality game called The Door. That was the first iteration of this thing. And students got their tasks from these fictional characters that were communicating them through email. So they actually had to use the skills that they were learning about how to communicate an email effectively. They had to write Word documents to create proposals for clients and stuff like that. So they were actually applying what they were learning, but then there were two tiers to the story. One was this like every day just trying to work for clients things like you guys are doing basically. And then the second tier was this fictional narrative where the Greek gods were trying to emerge out of the internet and restore themselves because they had lost all of their believers over the years, and this was a way for them to restore their belief systems and everything. And it was just this whole narrative, and the two things matched along. And the students, if they chose to engage with the narrative, could uncover stuff, and they get bonus points in the course for engaging more. And just it was all right. And so I learned a lot. I learned the things that students didn't like a whole lot. I learned the things they did like. I learned the things the instructors didn't like and what they did like and the things that were hard to manage. It was a complex thing. So at a certain point, I figured out that the students um, were starting to cheat. They were sharing kind of solutions and information from one semester to the next. And so they weren't really learning anymore. So we developed a second version called Broken Window. And in Broken Window, I decided that, they could do more. They could engage in more creative and critical thinking and engage with global problems. And one of my doc students, who was awesome, she did her dissertation related to the United Nations Millennium Development Goals. And so the characters were all working on one of those goals. So students were exposed to these problems and these challenges, and the game narrative and the course narrative all matched along with that so they could engage in the story, but also engage in big global problems. And so that worked pretty well until, again, students started cheating and sharing the solutions, so they weren't really learning again. And then a secondary problem popped up, which was we also figured out the students were struggling with the creativity and the creative or the critical thinking parts, and they couldn't do a lot of what we were asking them to do because they walked out of high school lacking basic self-regulated learning skills. Does anybody know what self-regulated learning skills are? Hearing none. Self-regulated learning skills are the things that we use, you all as students use, when I give you a task, for example, that's a big task. So we've got tasks like complete and share your developed materials. So I've got some directions here that are fairly specific, but I don't tell you exactly how to share them, exactly what you're supposed to say to your peers. So you have to break that big task down into small tasks and make some decisions on your own about the best way to share information with your peers, sharing your documents. What should I say? What is going to be most helpful to them? What should I focus on? That's up to you to decide as a learner. How am I going to best benefit this other person? How then am I going to take the feedback that I get from that person and inform my materials? So a lot of this gets down to decisions that you have to make. You're regulating these things yourself. Things like taking notes. So as you're building these things out, you're not just leaving everything up on web pages. You're probably taking notes on paper or in digital form. So that would be a self-regulated learning skill. Communication skills, interpersonal communication skills, those are definitely in there. Time management would be another huge thing that students have to be able to do in order to make sure that they complete things on time. So what we kept finding in the reflections from the students and then talking to them in interviews is they hadn't really been taught these skills in high school. Everything was just regimented. It was extremely overly described. They had to do X, Y, and Z at these exact times. And if they didn't do them, then there was either some punishment or no punishment, whatever the case may be. And so when they came into a course where they were expected to take charge of their own learning and have to overcome these things and organize their what they were going to do and how they were going to do it, they were not doing it well. Not that they weren't capable, they just hadn't learned it yet. So in the third iteration, which I just finished a book chapter on that I'm sending in tomorrow for an edited book, it's called the 2015 Project. And we took those United Nations Millennium Development Goals that related to child mortality and empowering women globally, environmental sustainability. There are 8 of them. We, again, structured the narrative around that in order to try to liberate these students from where they come from, liberate them from the idea they could only do what they were told to do by the system or by an instructor so that they could engage in self-regulated learning. We actually taught them specifically how to do that. And we had to do some more direct instruction in many instances than we had originally wanted to because students just weren't ready. So sometimes this student analysis, you can't just do it once because student needs change regularly over time. And so the materials that you created in 2006, 2007 are no longer maybe appropriate in 2010. And the stuff that you made in 2010 by 2012 may no longer be appropriate. By 2015, it's no longer appropriate. And at a certain point, you have to decide if you're going to keep doing it. And I don't do it anymore with that particular course because I don't really have time because as you progress through your career as a professor, you wind up with other things you have to do. But again, it's those iterations, and I feel like, and reflecting back on it, it's something that I'm asking you to reflect, but it's not something I don't do. Every time I write an article or book chapter like this, I'm engaged in reflection on the quality of the instructor design. I'm engaged in this critical process of understanding what can I do better from time A to time B? What materials would make this better next time? How could I restructure this? How can I reorganize this to meet the student instructor needs in a more meaningful way? So again, as you develop this, it doesn't have to be perfect. But I want you to try to think deeply about what is going to meet the instructor needs, the subject matter experts needs that you are working with. And are there any places where you can make it more engaging for students? And it may be one of those things where they tell you, hey, this is what I want. And you come back with that and you're like, hey, but maybe we could do this. And you show them this cool thing that you built. It didn't take you that long. Don't overinvest too much time in stuff where you don't think it's going to go anywhere. But definitely think about it. Now, the other component, which we're going to think about for next week, there is this link here, and this is the CECS 1100 faculty job aid. And so part of the reason that I mentioned the iteration is that this is what's called a job aid And the job aid exists in order to basically um, help the instructor know what they're supposed to be doing and when. So part of what I want you to think about as you develop your materials is if someone else was telling you to do this, what would you need to know in order to be able to use the materials to perform the instructional role with the activities here? So, let's make it bigger. So this is just a fairly extensive. So at one time, this is called CECS 1100. It eventually became LTEC 1100. Um, we used to be Computer Education and Cognitive Systems, and then we became Learning Technologies. I'm pushing to change the name again. I haven't figured out what I really want us to be called, but we're having trouble marketing it because the name itself is not, well, let's just say the people that we need to convince to spend money marketing our degrees are, they don't understand what learning technologies means. It's not self-evident, so we're losing out on opportunities to market our programs. So basically, getting back to this, I just want you to read through. And so there's a little introduction to what the course is, what they're supposed to do before starting the class, who the people are, um, where the materials are that they have to have access to. This, when I built this originally back in 2007, our options were WebCT or Moodle. So I did Moodle. Again, the lab manager is in there, so you want to make sure that you reference any people that they need access to. There's information about what needs to be done and when. So part of what you need to be thinking about with these materials is what's going to be released at what time, what do they need access to, as you're planning all this stuff out, and that way folks can get stuff set up. Um, so a lot of this is like, okay, just thinking through all the back end of getting everything built, and getting everything set up. It's a lot of work. And so if the instructor needs to have it, then you need to make sure that it's written down and accessible. Um, so I want you to read through this. Please read through it because you're going to build a job aid. Now, this is just an example, but it does work through. Now, you'll note WordPress is referenced in here. I have been using WordPress in my classes for a very long time because it's easy to build in and it works pretty well. But even here, I was building some of the characters, web pages, and WordPress. This is back in 2006, 2007. It's been around for a while. So definitely read that, please, for next week. Um, do y'all have any questions about the materials, or are you pretty good with that? Part of the purpose tonight was just to talk through some of these examples so that you, partly because I want you to know that I have a lot of empathy for what you're dealing with clients. So it's a learning process, and it's going to be all right. Oh, for sure. Yeah, definitely. If a client has some materials that they've already built and you want to adapt them or they just want to include them and you want to figure out how to do that, fantastic. If they just want to kind of upscale them, take them from 1080p to 4K or something like that, and just polish them up and make them shine, absolutely. That's the easiest way to do it if you can. Like you guys, somebody mentioned withered technology, lateral thinking. If you can think differently about something they've already done, because No, that's good. Um, Sometimes instructors have already done something that they like and students are responding to. They just want to kind of take it to the next level. And if you can help them do that, that's awesome. Sometimes sometimes your job as a designer, sometimes your job as a thinker is to generate something that other people haven't really thought of before. You're building an idea from scratch. Sometimes your job is to adapt something that's already there to a novel situation, to apply things in a new way, to do something in a novel way with something that's already there. It's that lateral thinking component. And either can be super beneficial. I mean, Steve Jobs, he didn't invent the computer, he just did some interesting things to make it easier to use. They were successful. I, I broke my iPhone 8 out at the state park on Friday and had to get a new phone. I have an iPhone 11. It's very pretty. It's the green one. I like it. You can't really tell it's green even though I got a clear case. But there's some cool features about the new one. I like the face stuff and it's cool. Is it a whole lot different than the Android phone that I messed with a few years ago? No, and there's a lot of stuff that Android has been advancing way faster than Apple has. But yeah, there's a little bit of stealing here and there. But sometimes it's about how you package it, it's how you put it together, it's how you adapt it and change it. And so it doesn't always have to be new. Plus, sometimes people do stuff better than you do, and they can build. It's already built, so you can use things that other people have included. So these courses that these folks are doing overseas, I didn't come up with the idea of humanizing online teaching and learning. I've created a couple of videos to go in there, but there are other folks who have done this way better than I have, and so I'm linking some of their videos in so that they can use those as part of the resources there. I want them to watch these 5 to 7 minute videos that are done professionally and look really good. I have to record video in my bedroom. So, I'm not going up to the office to pull the green screen and doing all that fun stuff. Um, so, using other resources that already exist, that's part of the reason people put free resources out there so you can do that. But there are other things where I built stuff from scratch because I wanted them to follow a process that I thought would be valuable to them. And in fact, I actually wound up taking one of those documents that I built over there and included it here because, it's a good document. And that's good. So we've got about 15 minutes left in what I said we are going to do, and I'm not going to have it take too long here. I did a get out of here, articulate. I did a PowerPoint, and I don't love doing PowerPoints, but I did one that I'm not super unhappy with. Oh, it's messed up. Um, so I created this thing called a scorecard framework in order to try to increase student engagement. Is what the plan is. So I'm just going to share this with you because it's relevant. Now I did one that's got a voiceover that I'll put up if you are interested in. You can either look at the one that's not got a voiceover or the one that does. But it's just a PowerPoint. So it's fairly pretty. It was a good template. Some of the new templates I'm pretty pleased with. So one of my professors, he was actually my minor professor at Indiana University once upon a time, this dude named Kurt Bonk. And he came up with this concept called Tech, TEC variety. And it's about choosing activities to help improve student engagement. Now, his framework was a little longer and had some stuff that I found a little redundant, and I needed something that was my own. So I created this thing called the scorecard framework. And it focuses on things based on my own experience. And so the scorecard framework starts with a safe learning climate, requires encouraging collaboration with peers, making sure that the outcomes of your courses include useful learning products, things that students can actually use once they get out of your course, uh, provide regular feedback on student performance, try to evaluate learning in different ways, make sure that the challenge of your course and the activities and the materials are appropriate to students' abilities, ensure that there's some form of an assortment of learning activities, ensure that the work is interesting, that it's relevant, that it's authentic. This is what we were talking about before with you actually practicing instructional design, not just reading about it. And then also another thing that I like to do is have learners decide on the activities and assessments. Sometimes it's just through feedback. So I'll take the summative feedback at the end of a semester and use that input to inform what I'm going to do the next time. In other courses, especially at the doc level, um, I'll give folks choices of what they want to do in terms of what the outcomes are going to be and how I'm going to assess them. And that gives some locus of control, which, according to the adult research, is helpful. So, again, that safe learning climate, you want to make sure that students have a sense of comfort, that they feel like they belong in there, that they are safe to explore, and that they can make mistakes and they're not going to be harmed by those mistakes, that they can have the opportunity to learn from them. And so the research shows that if we feel safe to make mistakes, that we grow, and we grow a lot faster. So it's important to do that. Encouraging collaboration with peers, there's a lot of different ways we can do that. I mean, I don't like public discussion forums particularly. I noticed over the years that I spend way too much time in the discussion forums, but other folks really like them. And you can use them so that students can challenge each other. Like if they have an idea or they have a concept that they can't defend, then you can let the students talk them through it and work it out. That's great. But I'll tell you, most students don't really love having discussion forums graded, but at the same time, I have never figured out how to make people really participate in a discussion forum unless it's graded. And that means that for me, it's just not a super useful tool overall. A lot of the time, I'll use public discussion forums only if I can't be present and I still want to encourage discourse about a topic. But overall, what is the first question most students ask as there's a public discussion forum in a learning management system? Any idea? It's the first thing I always get asked. Same question I always got asked in a K-12 environment. Come on. The chat is fighting me. How long does it have to be? Do you have to respond? Is it a grade? For sure. How many times do I have to post? That's usually the very first question. How many times do I have to post? And then they do as few posts as they can possibly get away with as little in it as possible. And they usually do not respond to each other. And if they do, it's usually like inane. I agree with that. Very good point. So I just don't care for them. That's just me. It's been my experience. Plus, I had a class with 27 students in it. It was this class, in fact, a few years ago. And because the students were posting a lot because they were angry at each other, I was spending 30 to 40 hours a week just replying in the discussion forums and having like being woken up at 2 o'clock in the morning from text messages from students who are ready to go to the dean because somebody else had said something super mean to them. I just have not found them super useful, but other people do, so you can check it out. I like synchronous chats like this a whole lot because I can respond to students, I can ask questions. And I can dump you guys in breakout rooms and have you discuss, which we're going to do next time. But we can also do just straight synchronous chats where I can set a time period and do text-based chats where students can talk about stuff for an extended period of time, and I can be there to kind of support discourse. But I love breakout rooms. Well, there's lots of other ways that you can use technology. You can use Google Docs, and I could have you guys all working on, say, the same instructional design and all collaborating. But again, that for me has often, and based on what the research shows, you wind up with coattail riders in many instances with those where they come in and they like contribute as little as possible while still meeting the base requirement. And it's like group work anywhere else. Um, you get one or two people who does all the work and everybody else gets a grade. I have a colleague that I was in class with many years ago, and I set up this whole study that we were doing for class, and it was a giant amount of work. And I did all the writing, I wrote up the proposal, I wrote up the outcomes, everything else. All I needed was for them to come and do interviews with me with the students at the school, and they always had an excuse to not show up. And this particular person didn't contribute anything to the writing, didn't contribute anything to any of it. And this professor, and this is a trick that I don't care for. Sometimes professors will say, okay, I want you to reflect and give yourself a grade, and I want you to be critical about it and talk about what you can do better, and then tell me what grade you think you earned. And I was super honest. I'm like, okay, I gave myself a B plus. There were some things that I could have done better to manage the project. There were some things that I could have done better to get it done faster, but I was also trying to do my dissertation stuff at the same time. It was just a lot of work. But I was critical of myself, wanted to give myself room to grow. Well, that professor gave me a B plus, even though I had gotten an A on every assignment in the class. This other person who didn't show up to anything, didn't come to the meetings with the team, didn't do the data collection, didn't write anything, didn't do anything, gave herself an A, and she got an A. That happens a lot. So that's something that you really have to be careful with if you're using Google Docs or you're doing discussion forums or anything else like that. You have to kind of clearly state what the expectations are. Otherwise, and it's usually worse with undergraduates. I was really surprised when I had a doc student do it. I guess I hadn't really had that experience with master's students. So it's a little frustrating. But there's lots of other tools that you can use in order to allow that kind of collaboration. Um, Again, do real strong audience analysis. And then look for opportunities where students can learn. But you have to plan those activities. You have to be super specific. And one of the coolest things that I really like is having students design their own collaborative activities, because then they're making the decision, they're making choices about how they feel like they can best collaborate. I can't count on both hands and both feet how many times I have had students sitting in my office crying and screaming about other people refusing to collaborate or just making group work miserable. So you have to really think clearly about how that's going to happen and manage it and have clear norms for it. And again, regular, timely, and effective feedback on performance. So in my house, I have an undergraduate who also attends yours and my illustrious institution, because I am an alumni of UNT as well. She is taking a class this summer. I think it's in like environmental ethics or something. She's an environmental philosophy major, and still has yet to get any feedback. And it's a 5-week course. This is week 5. Has not gotten any feedback yet on anything. Bunch of things we're supposed to get feedback. Plus, just supposed to get peer feedback in one instance. The peer person had dropped the class and the instructor didn't notice, stuff like that. So it's really important to make sure that we give feedback is close to when it takes place. Think about basic behaviorism in this instance. If you have a stimulus, and in this instance, the stimulus is the activity that I just did, and when should you give it a response to that performance, that stimulus? Those of you that know behaviorism, when? Anybody? How close to, let's say you're trying to train your dog and the dog does something you like, how quickly should you give them a treat?
Immediately.
Exactly. You want it to be as close to the performance as possible. And it's the same thing with students. So you want to make sure that you can give them that feedback as quickly as possible. One of my challenges personally as a professor for years was that I wanted students to have as much time to practice and get as much opportunity to do as many things as possible. But it also meant that I had to do an insane amount of grading all the time. It was super time consuming because, like, you will get line edited feedback in your next document. That takes a really long time for me to go through that document and kind of make corrections and put in comments and do all that stuff. And I was asking students to do like a couple, two, three things a week that required that level of grading. So I couldn't give the feedback as quickly as I wanted to. And I was behind and I felt bad about it. And what I found is that not everything has to get feedback right away. Sometimes things are just for practice and you get a turn in grade. But other times, then I need to give feedback much more quickly. Sometimes it can be just me talking in class about things that I'm seeing kind of across everybody, doing quick checks of understanding to see if you guys did the reading. That kind of stuff is helpful. There's a lot of different ways we can do this, but it's also helpful if you can get students to give peer feedback because it gets them in the habit of doing it, gives them practice doing it. And so you want to build in activities that students can engage in that allow opportunities to get feedback where it can be distributed, because I can't do all of it myself. There's often just too many people to give the feedback in the speed that I'd like to, or I want to focus on a different thing this week and I can have students look at it before I look at it, and hopefully it'll improve the quality of it before I ever see it. So that can also improve the speed of feedback in the future. So in terms of the outcomes having useful learning products, my goal is twofold with this course. For those of you that are master students, I want you to have something that can go into your portfolio. And with the portfolio, it's something that you have to graduate from our program. So you're getting something valuable there. But it's also something that you can use to show potential employers that you are qualified to be an instructional designer. You can show them the quality of your work and it helps you get employed. So if I can build a course that has work outcomes that students can clearly connect, that's going to be incredibly important to them buying into what I'm doing in the course. It's going to make it more meaningful, and making something useful often helps students to see things as being meaningful. This one is broken. We're going to skip that. This is the wrong one. Never mind. That's okay. So evaluate learning in different ways. So I have you guys do reflections most weeks, partly because that's for you primarily. It helps me informally assess learning. Great. But there's a lot of different ways that we can assess learning, and they don't all have to be formal. We tend to be, because we live in a test-driven culture, we tend to believe that everything needs to be sort of tested. Sometimes just give somebody a little practice activity and see if they can do it. And you do it in such a way where they're not having to do it out in front of everybody. I don't know if any of you, and some of you are way too young to remember this movie, but I did make my children watch it. Has anybody ever heard of a movie called Better Off Dead with John Cusack back in the 80s?
I want my $2.
Yes, that's the one. So I made my kids watch this last week, and they actually really liked it. I was pleasantly surprised. I saw that movie originally in the theater back when it came out, and it is the reason I eventually bought a black Camaro in the 90s. Was because of that movie, and he had this amazing black Camaro. Just neither here nor there, but there's this one scene that takes place in a classroom, and the guy there is just giving them this insane math work to do, and everybody's like super engaged with it, and they're all like, he's like, who wants to show me their solution? And everybody's like, me. You know, those kids are just way too engaged. Not everybody's going to be engaged with being up in front of the classroom and showing their solutions. That's really scary. And if you evaluate students always in really high stakes ways, that's really painful. And it makes students not want to engage in the future. They're always just trying to figure out a way to not have to be up there, especially if you've got a lot of introverted students. They do not care for that at all. I did not like to be out in front of the room. And hell, I became a poetry major. That tells you how much I like to be out there. Nowadays, I have no problem with it, but I had to learn, I had to overcome all that. But if you're asking students to do public presentations and they're really uncomfortable with it, you may want to give students different options for how they can be evaluated that are going to match with what's going to make them most comfortable. And you don't want it to feel like a punishment. You want them to be able to show what they know without hurting them. And that's a big deal. Now, having the challenge appropriate to the student ability, we all that have ever been students ourselves in the classroom or have been teachers know it is really hard to make sure that an activity is appropriate to all the students in the classroom. So, how do we deal with that? The question is, how do we keep students from getting frustrated because the work is too hard, the assignment is too hard? One of the best ways that I found is to talk to them, to ask, and to change the activity going forward. Part of the way that I do formative assessment, formative evaluation of my class is I review your blogs. I review the end of course evaluation, but really when I just look at what you're saying in the blogs, it tells me, is this appropriate to your level? And this course I've been teaching since 2006. I have made many changes to it, and I have reduced the complexity and the difficulty of the course over time down to what feels like, based on the feedback that I get from you as students in the blogs and in the feedback at the end of the course and in verbal conversations with you outside of it once I see you face to face or in synchronous meetings or whatever. Um, it's about where it's supposed to be. It's that kind of just right temperature for a lot of folks, but it doesn't mean that it is perfect for everybody. It may be still too hard for a couple of folks who may not have the background. So for me as an instructor, I can still reduce the challenge further informally by talking to individual students. If you tell me it's still too hard, we can figure out a way to make it better. That's scaffolding. That is me providing additional support for a learner to help them get there and not to punish them for the level being too hard. So that is really helpful, is having this ability to change the challenge. And in some instances, I've had students, including in this class right now, who are like, I need to do this much bigger project. I already understand a lot about instructional design. I've been asked to do this. You asked for this thing, which is this size. I need to do something that's 5 to 10 times larger than that. Can I do that? Here's the evidence that I'm able to do that. Please let me do it. Yes, I let you do it, and I increase the challenge based on what our conversation is. So a lot of this is not having a standardized curriculum that is overly inflexible. It's about developing a curriculum that you can change and adapt in a way that meets individual student needs up or down. And then having an assortment of learning activities is super important. Each week, I had you guys do some weird stuff the first couple of weeks to try to kind of get your head around analysis and thinking things in different ways. And then since then, we've been walking through this process of you're adding to your instructional design document, but the activities each week that you're doing are different. And you're engaged in revision and you're making improvements. And so there are different learning activities that you're engaged with each week. Some of them are the same because they're meta activities for me, like the reflections, where I really want you to think about what you're doing and think about how you're learning it. But you can also give students different activities that they can participate in. So you can give choices, and that helps improve engagement. So mixing up the activities each week is great. This week I've simplified everything because right now you're just making stuff and that takes a lot of time. So I want to give you the time. But giving a variety each week, like let's say I can give you option A and B, and I do this in some of my courses, especially in the doc courses. Um, you may have the option to just write a reflection because that's helpful to you. Because let's say you already work in a field that does a lot of instructional design work, but you're refining those skills. That may be a better choice for you because you really need to think more deeply about your personal work. But let's say you haven't really done this. Your current job doesn't lend to reflecting on your work. Having the option to think about a problem that came up in readings and then taking part in a small group discussion in a discussion forum if you want to, or having an independent discussion, then reporting back on it. That would be a way to give student choices and different types of learning activities to engage in. And then making sure that they have relevant, authentic, and interesting work. This is going to be a big deal. How many times have you heard, and I remember hearing this over and over and over again when I first started teaching, and I don't know, it still like resonates in my head. I can think of this one kid who's, God, how old is he now? This would have been 1995, 96. So he would have been, he was 15 then. Is that right? Yeah, so he'd be almost as old as I am. Um, every single time I would ask him to do something, he'd say why. And this is the big question with relevant, authentic, and interesting work is why? Why do I need to do this? How does this transfer to my future work context? If you're just telling me to do it because you have power and authority over me, fine, I have to do it. But if you can motivate me by explaining that this is going to have relevance to what I have to do in the future and I can make those connections, it's going to be way more meaningful. Plus, cognitively, you're going to make a lot more neurological connections. So students are going to retain it way longer. So it's super important to make sure that this stuff is relevant. And sometimes things just aren't interesting. So sometimes there's just grunt work that has to be done. True. But if somebody's engaged in the grunt work, I listen to podcasts about people who do a lot of cycling and mountain biking and mountain climbing. And these folks do incredibly painful things that a lot of ordinary folks would just think is incredibly boring. I watched this dude practice constantly with his fingers inside his van, just trying to climb up the side of this thing and just strengthening his hands. So all the dude did for like extended periods of time. But because he knew how that was going to translate in his performance later, he could see that direct connection. It was super engaging to him. So that's part of what you need to do. Having an explanation of why it's authentic and why it's relevant, connecting to students through that story of experience, like the stories that I told you about my experience earlier, so that you could see how that transfers to the world of work, how it applies. That gives folks that cognitive scaffolding on which to build engagement, to build interest. Without it, they're just doing it without any expectation that it's going to be beneficial, and they will forget it right away. And then finally, we have the decide activities and assessments with learner input. So this class is too short. Often with my 16-week classes, I'll kind of offer, hey, here's 3 potential projects that we can work on, or here's 5 projects, and you guys can choose one as a group to do, and another group can choose another one. And that gives students control over it. Or, hey, if there's a project you want to do and you've got an idea and you want to outline it in this way and you can get other people to work on it, fantastic. And then we're going to sit down and break down week by week what activities you're going to do and how I'm going to assess learning in this instance, what are going to be the performance outcomes. And we're going to structure this. We're going to have a living course. In other instances where it has to be much more heavily structured, where there are very specific performance outcomes that have to be there, then sometimes just giving some limited choices within a set scope is also possible, and students kind of just choose. Like in this particular course that you're in right now, what would be one example of an activity and assessment that you had choice over? It's not under.
Our design that we
Yeah,
picked.
exactly. You guys got to pick the entire project that you're working on for the entire 10 weeks, pretty much. You got to find a client. You got to pick something that was interesting to you, hopefully. You have a client that you're working with, and you're building out something in that instance. So this was a way for me to give you choice. And it also hopefully builds a sense of responsibility and engagement, because you're also working for a client who now has expectations of you. So that also builds responsibility on your end, because you've got somebody whose needs you've got to meet in this instance, and you want to do a good job. So this would be one way that we do this. Now, again, I mentioned a couple times, by the end of all of this, I never just stop here. And you want to improve the course, so sometimes you use formative and summative reflections. Um, like I said, I usually use your blog reflections to see if things are going well or poorly. What can I do better? What are you engaged with? What are you understanding? What are you not understanding? That's my way of doing formative evaluation of the course and the activities. If one week you just clearly are not engaged with something, or the vast majority of students aren't, that leads me to understand that maybe I need to change that next time. Now, another way that was recommended to me by the undergraduate in my house would be to do something like use a weekly poll to see if students like activities. And then you can use that data in order to change the course going forward. And end of course feedback is always helpful in the summative if you are willing to use it. Um, Most of the time, the scores wind up kind of meaningless because there's so many biases in the data. However, the qualitative feedback can be good. Now, I will recommend if you have extremes in your data where you've got 1 or 2 people at one end who are super positive and 1, 2, 3 people at the other end who are super negative, for whatever reason, sometimes you get really negative feedback because they don't take students out, even if they failed the class. Um, and sometimes students fail the class because they didn't do the work. But that data still goes in. But if you can pull out the extremes and look at the stuff in the middle that helps you improve your performance, that's a great way to do it, because then you can build a much more engaging course. So I mentioned before, sometimes you just build stuff so that you can help folks. So this was the scorecard checklist that I built, the engagement elements, the checklist item descriptions, and then somebody can just look at the course, walk through it, check off if they feel like there's a safe learning climate, specify what could be improved, and just really give some quick feedback on individual courses. So this is a little thing that I built so that the folks in these universities overseas can evaluate each other's courses quickly. And so that's that. So this is just a little thing that because I needed to shift from having a 7 module course into basically something that I could present um, in an hour in the morning and an hour in the afternoon on Tuesday, and then have a separate one for humanizing stuff on the Thursday in the morning and the afternoon. I built this out so that I would be able to give them something to walk away with, including this little scorecard so they can evaluate each other's courses. Um, I'm going to put the scorecard up there, and if you guys want to use that as a guide uh, for your feedback on your peers' stuff this week, that's great. If you want to do it a different way where you give other feedback, that's also cool. But again, I want to give you a choice of how you're going to do this. Yeah, so y'all are awesome, and I'm sorry this went a little bit long, but I just wanted to just share a little bit about like what my experience is here, so that you guys can think about how you do stuff. Because honestly, it's this sharing this experience that, at least for me, tends to be super awesome for learning. Um, any questions or thoughts? Because it's 7:30, and I'm gonna let you go, but I just want to make sure I answer any of your questions before I do that. Hearing none, I am going to post your peers. It'll be up there probably in the next half an hour. Um, I'm going to post the PowerPoint that I just did and the scorecard uh, checklist. So those will be both, or all of those things will be up there shortly. One last thing that I need to check before I release you. So next week, no meeting. Um, I want you to have time to work, and so um, I want you to build. So my recommendation in terms of getting feedback to your peer would be by say next Wednesday or Thursday. Yes, I'm going to pair you with peers, and that'll be posted here in the next 30 minutes or so. Um, so if you can get it to folks by like get the feedback to your peers. Let's see. I'm gonna go ahead and put this in here right now. Okay. So what I'm doing is I'm adding a little bit of additional information here, and part of this is I'm going to get feedback from you here in a second to make sure that it works. Um, so post your development. Uh, Giving you a little bit of extra time just because it takes a little bit longer to build the development materials. So let's say Monday at 11. That is, I believe, the 6th, but I'm going to confirm that. Yeah, so Monday the 6th. Yes, hey. Sorry, I usually let the dog stay in here because my neighbors go nuts for their sleep. Let's see if this works for y'all. So, based on what we've just discussed, I would like you to send your development materials to your peer review partner by Monday, July 6th, 2020 at 11:59 p.m. You should be able to send it to them within Canvas. Um, if not, if you have trouble with it, just use the contact in Canvas to get another email to send to them. However, that's going to work best for you. And then return your development materials back to your partner by Thursday, July 9th at 11:59 p.m. That gives you Friday, Saturday, and Sunday to do your revision and get your job aid turned in, which is also due that day. Does that work?
I think so. Currently, the way it's set is the I think is like this Sunday is supposed to have actual feedback in the
Yeah.
assignment,
So
right?
what I'm going to do is now modify that
Okay.
to meet this requirement, but I wanted to talk this through before we set it. All right, let me do that real quick. Yeah, no, I'm going to fix that now. Yeah, the development submission is going to be, hang on one second. I'm going to go through and adjust all those now that we've got this new timeline. Part of my goal with this was I just walked through the student engagement thing. Now I'm using your feedback to edit the due dates and all that fun stuff so that I can model it. Funny thing that. So the initial development submission is just you turning in what you got without edits. So you'll turn that in just so that I can see that you've turned it in, and you're just going to get a grade for having turned it in on time. So let me show you sharing here. Okay, so that's this one is the week 5 initial development submission, which is due July 5th. I just want to see that you got something turned in before any feedback goes in. I'm not giving you feedback on that. I just want to see that you've made progress on it at that point. Now the peer feedback, we're going to edit here so that it matches what I just said. Okay. So that is now July 9th. Okay, so that's good. And so what you're going to submit here is the feedback that you gave to. Sorry, my internet connection just went unstable for a second. So in this, you are turning in the feedback that you provided to them. So I can review and make sure that you actually did give them feedback. Because I have had students in the past not do that, which is not great.
And this is on the design document that we've all been working on, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the same document all the way through, just constant iterations and revisions and additions.
Right. It's not actual content that you've created. It's all that document.
Correct. Um, so yeah, your big one, the next one that I'm going to see that's going to be the big one is going to be week 7 with the implementation and evaluation plan document. That's going to have your other information in it, and then your client review, week 6 next week. You're going to just tell me what the client said based on what you have submitted, so that I can see that that you're actually getting feedback. And July 12th, you're going to turn in your job aid. Those are the directions for the instructor. And then there's a little form here for sharing job aids. So there's this thing, this Padlet that we're going to do week 7. And I just wanted to note this. Please go through and follow these directions before week 7 so that we're ready to do that in week 7. And let's see. Yeah, I think that gets us to week 7 and we should be in good shape. All right.
I've got a question about this initial development submission in week
Yes.
6.
Yep.
So now is that going to be, is that the document that we've been working on as well, or is that going to be?
Yep. It's the same document. You're just
Okay.
for the rest of this session, you're just working in the same document.
Okay. Now in previous weeks, like, we have some guidelines as to like what needs to be included in that document, like through each of like the phases of ADDIE. Like, are we going to, like, when I look at the directions here for week 6, like, are there any guidelines for that? I didn't see any.
No, you're just describing the activities and you're building the materials. And since
Okay.
that is entirely dependent on each of you, and I don't necessarily, I can't control what 27 different people are doing. I can't give that level of specificity in the directions.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure. But yeah, this is the part where it gets flexible and weird. But again, this is where part of the whole thing too is the way that this course is designed is each week I take a little bit more of the scaffolding off and let you see more and more of how things fit together and how it builds into your course from one week to the next to the next. So that by the end of this, the whole goal is that you have done the practice, you've done the work this time. And so in the future, you're able to go off and independently do these things all on your own again. And that's the whole scaffolding model in this instance.
So just to clarify, like we're going to be expanding on our learning activities, and what else did you say? I'm sorry.
Sorry, the dogs just went off. So you're expanding on the learning activities, and then in week 6, you're building out your job aid. Those are the directions for the instructor on how to use the product you built.
No, I'm sorry, for week 5, like for this
for
week.
week 5.
Yes.
So the activities and the materials. So whatever it is that students are going to be interacting with. So if you're having to build out rubrics that they're going to use, if you're building out PowerPoints, if you're making videos, whatever those things are, that's what you're building.
Okay, but like in our document itself, like we're just describing those materials, or are we actually?
No, you'll include them. So if you have a Word document or a PDF that you need to convert into a Word document, you're going to add all of those in there.
In my case, like I'm actually building this class, like I'm going to use it. Like, let's say I've already built them, like in Canvas. Like, can I, like, how could I include it? Can I like include the link for you to look at them?
You could do screenshots, or you could do links. That's really up to you how you want to do it. Some people have done screenshots, and some people have done links. And so, to give you an example, one of my students, he built a class for 5th grade math, and he just added me to the Canvas course.
Yes.
So you could do that, and that would work great.
Cool. Yeah, I'll include a link then for you to join.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, great question. Yes, and yeah, including the Google site would be great. However, it's going to work for you. Let's say there's a PowerPoint that you want them to look at, or a YouTube video or whatever. You can include the links, and you can just embed whatever those are directly in the development components and the activities component, however you want to embed it in the document, or you can just create it like a separate document with links to those materials if they're digital materials, or you could just embed them all in a Word document, or a PDF, or however it is that you think it's going to make the most sense to them. As you're evaluating it, think of it as if you were trying to teach this, and think of questions that you would have and the things that are clear and unclear. Any issues with the materials where maybe something's not self-evident, that kind of thing. And also think about any things that they could do to make it more interactive or more engaging. And so you'll have the scorecard engagement model thing up there if you want to use that. But if you have another model that you want to use, that's totally good too. That makes sense. Awesome. This is great. This is the whole purpose for this was to do exactly this. And I have to say, and I just want to compliment you all, the way that you interact and the way that you ask questions and engage in this way is, I don't get this all the time with students. Some people are just in the class to get it over with and get done. So I really appreciate how much you do here, and it's awesome. So thank you. But in the meantime, I will see all of you in 2 weeks. Let me know if you need anything. I'll hop on here between 6 and 7 next week just to make sure that there's no issues. Yes, and Mark, what I'm going to do is close the room and then just reopen it. So just log back in. Okay.
Thanks.
Sure.